Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Eccles. I'm one of the health reporters here at POLITICO in Brussels. The life sciences sector is one of the historically thriving, innovative sectors in Europe, which has traditionally been a leader in medicines, home to some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, while our universities and hospitals have long been seen as global leaders in clinical training and in research. But is that reputation now faltering as we lag behind rivals in the US and Asia on R&D growth as well as on drug launches? The Mario Draghi report last year blamed this on low investment in research and a poor uptake, a low investment in research and a poor uptake on AI, as well as a fragmented regulatory system. But there's also now the additional looming threat of American tariffs on the European industry, which, with impeccable timing for this panel, were confirmed last Friday by Donald Trump. So it's against that tumultuous and slightly gloomy backdrop that we're going to discuss the future of the industry, as well as take a look at the attempts by EU legislators to improve the outlook and maybe find some areas of optimism. So we welcome you to join the conversation on the social media channel of your choice. And I'd now like to invite our panelists on stage. Thanks. So please join me in welcoming Nathalie Moll, who is the Director General of the European Pharmaceutical Lobby Association, EFPIA, Emmanuel Cormier, Head of the Regulatory Science and Innovation Task Force at the European Medicines Agency, Gloria Gachier, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Cabinet of the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Health for Belgium, and Dean Summerfield, Senior Vice President of Real World and Commercial Solutions in the EMEA region at IQVIA. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. So the Draghi report, as I said, flagged the pharmaceutical industry as an area that perhaps could be a little more competitive. But I wanted to kind of set the scene, first of all, for those who maybe aren't super familiar with some of the issues facing the sector at the moment. And I'm going to do this in a very crude way, which I feel moderators overuse, so please go with me. And that's simply to ask each of you in turn, if you could rate out of 10 how competitive you think the European health sector is. I'd ask that you'd keep your answers in under a minute, just so that we get a sense of the big issues before we go into the meat of the discussion. So perhaps, can I start with you, Nathalie?
Thanks so much, Mary, and thanks for organizing this session. When I moved to Brussels 30 years ago, I would have said a 9.5. There was the science, there was slightly less capital, but there were a lot of burgeoning companies. I would say now between 5 and 6, which is really disappointing for an industry that contributes the most to the trade balance of the EU. We're talking 220 billion in a year, 55 billion research, 950,000 jobs. So it looks good if you take a picture now, but if you look at the trend, it's going down rapidly, concerning. We can make changes.
Okay. Yeah, what about you, Emmanuel?
No,
I think you're okay.
I'm okay, I'm all wired up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, perhaps if we leave it here and see how it goes.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a little bit more optimistic than Nathalie. I would say a solid 7. But looking forward, maybe more fragile than it looks like at the moment. I think we have a very solid innovation ecosystem, generally speaking. We have also, from a regulatory standpoint, a lot to offer to support that ecosystem. And actually, on the global scene, as regulators, we are still leading, some of these advancements in regulatory sciences.
What about you, Gloria?
I was also thinking a 7, but now I will go for an 8.
Okay.
Just because there should be some disagreement. Of course, the industry is facing some headwinds, it's clear. But at the same time, I'm Belgian. And I recently, for instance, saw a Belgian company being taken over for €1 billion that creates CAR T cells inside the body. So there is really still is a very strong ecosystem present, I think, in Belgium, but also in Europe, that we can harness and still make the most out of.
Thank you for the invitation. I think if we look at the scientific and technical prowess of Europe, I'd agree we're at the 7 or 8 level. If we look at the overall competitiveness in our health, then I have to agree with Nathalie that we're probably down at that 6. On a losing way compared to other regions. Yes, we might talk about China and the USA, but the Middle East is a go-to place for a lot of people today in healthcare.
Okay, cool. A bit of a range of opinion there that we'll dig into in a bit more detail throughout the panel. I think it would be remiss, though, if we didn't kick off by talking about the newsiest element, maybe, of this topic, which is obviously the pharmaceutical tariffs. Donald Trump has been threatening them for months to impose them on the pharmaceutical sector. The specific aim, he's said, of kind of enticing the industry from Europe. He's talked about Ireland in particular to the US. I wondered, Natalie, if we could get your reaction maybe about how members of FPA, which obviously include the likes of Novo Nordisk, Bayer, Pfizer, to name but a few, how are they going to deal with the 15% tariff that Trump has just confirmed on the European industry?
Yeah, so I think it's not a...
Oh, sorry, do we? Yeah, there you go. No worries.
Good, because I need a big mic. I think we haven't made a secret of the fact that there's a reason there have never been in 30 years of WTO any tariffs on pharma. Pharmaceutical products are not your average goods. They're there to provide help in cases of illnesses. So the 15% tariffs breaks that 30-year moratorium on having any tariffs on medicines. And in numbers, very simply, it equates to 18 billion loss. So it's like losing the entire UK market, if you like. What does that mean? That means that the impact on European industry, where the US is the first importer of European medicines, will become much less attractive, if you like, for us, because we buy our own medicines on the other side of the Atlantic and we then distribute them. There isn't somebody else who buys the medicines. So the cost is borne by the industry. You also don't pass on the cost to patients because prices are fixed. So it makes that competitiveness question that you asked me at the beginning, that's why I'm giving a 5 and 6 and declining. It's not because we're not good, we don't have science, we don't have the will, but it's because of all those things Draghi said last year, which we haven't really acted on yet. And the pull in the deglobalized world from the US on one side and China and Asia and maybe the Middle East from the other, pulling our industry away and making us less attractive as a place to do business and sell products. So it's a very concerning situation, and I think it will certainly not help our competitiveness. So urgent need for political leadership, decisions, and you're absolutely right. I mean, EMA is a star Team Europe example, but mostly we don't act as Team Europe. Mostly we act as the Europe of 27. And this doesn't help in healthcare, this doesn't help in competitiveness, because we're competing with parts of the world that are enormous, enormous markets. And we have 3 times more capital 3 times less capital, on average. So I think the ingredients were not good to start with. Tariffs makes it worse. And so that makes the urgency of making the right decisions now even more needed.
Dean, I wanted to ask kind of the same question to you around tariffs. I'm not sure if we've seen, I mean, I guess it's too early to say what potentially the impact is yet, because the announcement was only confirmed, as I said, last week. But do we have a sense yet from companies? And I'm especially intrigued to understand if we know how this might impact medium or smaller sized pharma companies. I don't know if any of them have made kind of any statements on this, but do we have a sense yet of how companies might be preparing or reacting to this news?
I mean, overnight, we've had the announcement by Pfizer, we're striking the most favored nation clause with the US, and we've seen how the markets have reacted just by that removal of uncertainty with respect to them yesterday, and with the rebound in what's been a very depressed sector. And building on what Natalie said, that uncertainty created has removed investment from healthcare for the last year and a half. Even for large companies, this is a complex thing to balance. I mean, the tariffs are just one component. It's all about manufacturing, supply chain, job creation, the pricing, a whole host of different things. So whilst one might focus a discussion on one component, easy like tariffs, and I agree with Natalie, it is making this content less attractive, but it's quite a complex picture. If you go to a small organization, if you go to a small company, then they don't have the resources to unpick that. So then again, they're making simpler decisions. We go to the large markets that are easier to navigate, whether that's the US, whether it's into China, whether it's the large single markets in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. That's taking the products away from the patients in our continent that need it.
As well as the tariff, there's also this parallel threat coming from the US, which is that Trump has obviously put pressure on companies to lower their drug pricing in the US to bring them closer in line with the cheaper prices in other countries. We've seen that play out a little in the UK already, where some companies have launched drugs at a higher US price. And I think we've also seen some European companies put some pressure on the Commission to relax price controls. But I wanted to ask you, Gloria, how do you kind of see this playing out in Europe? Do you think it will lead to an increase in prices for drugs in Europe?
Well, first of all, the European Commission is not the one to talk to if you want to relax price controls, because it's a national policy. Secondly, I think there's a very big difference between the US and Europe in terms of the way prices and access to medicines is being negotiated. In the US, your access to a certain medicine depends on the insurance policy that you can get, right? Whereas in Europe, you have a central body most of the times that negotiates market access and prices. If you want to come to Belgium, for instance, you supply everyone or you supply no one, and that's a major, major difference. And so it means that the price of a product is set in terms of course, its value, the additional quality of life that it creates, but also in terms of the sustainability of the overall health budget. I want to emphasize that most of the European countries have been struggling with keeping pace with the rising prices. For instance, in the during the last government tenure in Belgium, the pharma budget increased by 30%. We are at a growth pace of 7 or 8% per year, so our prices are rising. But of course, the question is, how do you keep the overall health budget sustainable? And that will also define the willingness to pay of governments.
Trump's impact on the pharma industry in Europe obviously isn't just limited to drug pricing and tariff threats, although those are really significant. But we've also seen the regulator in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, the EMA's counterpart in the US, reduce its workforce by, I think, 3,500 people. I'm just wondering, does the EMA at all see that as a potential competitive advantage for Europe if, and this is slightly speculating, but if the EMA is potentially seen as a more kind of stable regulator, especially when you take into account some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington around pharma and science more broadly? I mean, are you seeing more informal approaches from pharma companies who maybe see you as a slightly more credible regulator?
All right, so first of all, when we look European Medicine Agency and FDA, we don't look in competitive terms, to be honest. So what's happening in the FDA, as sad as it is for the individual at the FDA, we see the FDA as a collaborator, a partner in a very complex global ecosystem of regulators. So that it is important that we continue to foster that cooperation between the regulators in general, and particularly the FDA. We've been partners for over 2 decades. We have mutual recognition programs in place with the FDA. So in that sense, we don't think of an opportunity to feed on the demise of colleagues across the ocean. But clearly, it provides opportunity for us as regulators to position ourselves better in the global space. And I think it's very important to look at competitiveness from a regulator point of view in the sense of the global dimension. We don't want to create an environment in Europe that's so unique from a regulatory point of view that nobody wants to go to Europe. It creates hurdles for investors to come to Europe. We want to make sure we work toward harmonizations of standards and process globally so that the European market not only leads it, but also becomes more attractive for pharmaceutical companies and innovators alike to come in Europe.
I mean, you mentioned there that obviously you work quite closely or have done for decades with the FDA. Have you noticed any kind of shift in terms of like how they approach you or international regulators or their engagement more generally?
No, we haven't seen so much. As a matter of fact, we continue our programs. We have one of our officers present at the FDA and vice versa. We have an officer from the FDA present in our facilities in Amsterdam. And during that transition period of the Trump administration, we were worried that this program were going to be discontinued, but no, it continued forward, so that's reassuring. In terms of our participation to meeting, yeah, the FDA has reduced some participation to some platform, but still remains very engaged with us, yes.
Last thing on Trump before we move on to more EU-specific stuff. We know obviously that his pick in RFK Jr., who's a prominent vaccine skeptic as health secretary, has been quite controversial, and there's been criticism that there's a kind of anti-pharma, anti-science potentially approach when you look at things like the recommendation last week coming out of Washington advising women not to take what here we'd call paracetamol during pregnancy because of what they say is a link with autism. Many international health bodies, including the EMA, the WHO, issued statements immediately afterwards denying that link and speaking out about this essentially. But I just wondered, Natalie, as kind of the pharma industry, as pharma companies more generally, does this kind of attitude or rhetoric kind of have any impact on the willingness to invest or engage with the US?
So I couldn't speak in terms of company-specific decisions on investments because that's not my role. I think what really is concerning is that whenever you have a regulator casting doubts on science, you create a lot of uncertainty. So if you remember during COVID, how important it was to keep the population informed of the scientific developments and how hungry we all were to find solutions. And I think as soon as you destabilize that level of confidence in government and confidence in science, you risk ripple effects that go across the globe. There's no, now that we have internet and social media and AI and everything else, nothing can be contained anymore. And I think the impact long-term on confidence in science, confidence in vaccines, and our health together, all of us, is much bigger than what perhaps is understood when such statements are made. So I think it's not to be underestimated in terms of resilience, health resilience, but also security. When you put science in question, when you create more vaccine skepticism, you are putting in danger, if you like, health security and resilience.
I want to kind of move on now from the US and onto Europe specifically. So one of the areas I wanted to hone in on is kind of like the research environment in the EU. And we obviously have a lot of great unis here. But one area we're consistently told that Europe has been falling behind on is on clinical trials, which obviously has an impact on whether a drug is launched in a certain country or region. I think it was last week, maybe the week before, that the EU's Health Commissioner, Oliver Varhelyi, said that he wants to revise the clinical trials regulation as part of the upcoming Biotech Act, which he said will be proposed later this year. Before we get into that, I just wondered, perhaps, Dean, maybe if you could paint a picture of the current situation around clinical trials. Why is this so frequently an area where perhaps we're seen to be falling behind on other, compared to other regions?
I think a part of it goes back to what Natalie said at the start. We have a history of being a powerhouse in clinical research because of the scientific prowess, because of the good academic backgrounds, because of our history of bringing forward new medications through clinical research. The facts are clear. Our share of clinical research globally has declined significantly over the last few years. Partly that's been because of the rise of research within China itself for Chinese populations taking up a big part of the growth. So it's complex. But the reality is, when companies are making the decisions of where to source their research, there's two things that matter. How easy is it to navigate the complexity of starting clinical trials, so the regulatory frameworks and the other frameworks? And secondly, is the return there afterwards? Particularly with in clinical research today, 2/3 of the products in human research come from smaller companies, biotech scattered across the world. They have choices where to place their investment. And if they see countries or regions where, yes, they've got great science, but we're uncertain where we'll get the commercial uptake post-launch, then it becomes less attractive. So we can look at it in terms of the clinical trial landscape. But what's vitally important is not just that we're the scientific prowess we have, we can focus on clinical trials. But as a continent, we have to focus on getting that innovation to the patients and not just looking at the clinical trial landscape in itself.
I mean, do you want to come in on that? Yeah.
I think The approach. No, I've lost both my. That's so right, and Dean. And it's like for anything, you can't invent something and have nowhere to sell it. That doesn't work, right? And it's something interesting in terms of, we always look at this research, and research is fantastic, but if you don't have a market, and at the moment, the European market is unpredictable, and as we've seen, doesn't value innovation. And Gloria was explaining how difficult it is to match the kind of developments in science with the budgets. But then, you know, we have these siloed budgets where we have the pharma budget, the hospital budget. So if you look at Hep C, you've saved 11,000 euros per person cured who doesn't go into hospital anymore. Or the investment in Spain, 21 billion invested in pharma, 14.5 billion made savings in the healthcare system. So the problem is, if you only look at your pharma budget, yes, it's increasing because you have probably not just prices, but you have new treatments that are lifelong treatments or cures or whatever, and you're never capturing, it looks to me like you're never capturing the savings that you make through those anywhere else. And so you have this kind of siloed look, and that makes the market very unattractive because governments are not able to see the sustainability and become more and more reticent to give a value to the innovation. And so you're looking at a market that doesn't really value and pay for your medicines when there are lots of other constraints that we talked about earlier. So, you know, it's looking like minus, 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 minus when it needs to look like plus, plus, plus. And that takes a bit of a revolution, I think, or evolution of the system.
I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Gloria. Perhaps you could respond to it. And I also wanted to get a sense of how this plays out on a national level. Like, what does that mean for patients in Belgium, for example, if the clinical trials regulation isn't quite right?
Well, just to respond immediately, of course, we look at the impact on other budgets, right? In our pharmacoeconomic analysis that we use to evaluate medicines, you have a budget impact level 1, and that's what it costs. Level 2 is the savings that you make by the product replacing other products. And level 3 is the savings that you make because, for instance, people spend less time in the hospital. So it's definitely something that we look at, but the problem is our other budgets are not going down either, and we have a policy in place where we want to make mental health care accessible, and that also costs money. Or where we better want to remunerate nurses and doctors, and that also costs money. So it's rather complex, I would say, but it's not that it's not taken into account. Now, with regards to clinical trials, there's two things that I particularly care about. And the first one is that we have a lot of useless clinical trials because the sample sizes are too small. And there was an interesting study by the WHO on COVID clinical trials where it appeared that 95% of the clinical trials conducted during COVID were actually useless. And it's because we have no good systems in place to conduct multi-country clinical trials. So I'm quite glad with the Commissioner's announcements to revise the clinical trials regulation. I also think that there's a lot of work ahead in terms of the member states working together, in terms of working together on ethical reviews and stuff like this, but we need to do it. And then the second one is indeed patient access. There's a case that comes to mind of a child that wanted access to an oncology treatment in Italy, where it's clear that so there's not so many children with cancer, fortunately. And if you want to release a new product to treat cancer for children, then of course, as a researcher, you need to be able to recruit the children. You need to find the children. So these clinical trials usually are conducted in larger member states. It would be my wish in the life sciences strategy, but also in the revision of the clinical trials regulation, that we take this more into account, that patients and certainly children from all over Europe need access to these clinical trials, even if they're from a small member state. And we need a system in place to recruit patients from all over Europe. I think this would be a very important point, and also a point that shows that it's not only about competitiveness, but it's also about real people. It would be a point of attention.
Emmanuel, how, from a regulator's perspective, are there things that you think could obviously be changed as part of this regulation, or anything you'd like to add?
No, yeah, I mean, of course, as a regulators, we are very much aware of some of the shortcomings of the clinical trial environment, if you will, in Europe, and of the clinical trial regulation. But we need to remember there is still a heavy component of the member state in the conduct of clinical trial. But the initial intention of the clinical trial regulation, and when we put in place the clinical trial information system, which is kind of the informatic platform to support that, is very much an intention to centralize more of that process, so it's a single application for clinical trial that the member state can also access to that single platform. And there is a value in centralization, but there is still a lag and an engagement and maybe a commitment on the member state level to kind of follow through with that centralization. Now, I think the point that you made on multinational clinical trial is something we are also very much pushing forward as well. We've put in place a collaboration between the Commission and the member states called ACT EU, Accelerated Clinical Trial in Europe, and it has elements of fostering and pushing for multinational clinical trial. We have also incorporation of real-world evidence, real-world data to help as well in the execution of some of this clinical trial, get access to the right population, etc. There is the element of using some of the data we have in CETIS to maybe better engage with the potential participant of clinical trial healthcare professional. Recently, we rolled out what we call a clinical trial map. And in this map, we make a visual in a click of a button all the clinical trials that are being conducted in Europe. And a patient could, within the 3 clicks of a computer mouse, identify if there is a clinical trial which is currently recruiting or soon to be recruited in the disease area. They may be interested in participating. So these are the small things we can contribute to. Also supporting novel methodologies or design of clinical trials, things we need to do. So there's a lot in that space, definitely. There has been progress through the clinical trial regulation and the implementation of some aspects, but definitely more that could be incorporated in future iteration of that.
Sticking with kind of regulation issue or regulation in Brussels, the pharma package, which is the huge revamp of the rules governing the pharma industry, is being negotiated between EU countries and the Parliament at the moment. We heard today that the countries are hoping to find an agreement with the Parliament by the end of the year. And I just wondered, Natalie, how confident are you that the Danish presidency will be able to shepherd an agreement that you think would meet the industry's asks?
Thanks, Mary. I mean, first of all, speed is really important right now because the uncertainty that Dean was talking about before was also about this. The regulatory framework is unclear. The incentives are unclear. When the incentives are unclear, the decisions you made 15 years before you ever get a product is now. And so companies have been sort of wondering, well, do I go to Europe or not? So really important to get the agreement on the final text that will last probably for the next 20 years. In terms of meeting industry's expectations, I think we all realize that the text will at best, hopefully, improve the regulatory environment. I mean, that would be awesome, that we could have a leaner, faster process with adapted to the next 20 years of technology, whatever they might be. Mm-hmm. So, with some ability to test. I think that would be the best case scenario that we have with the current compromises. We're not going to get a bit more attractive incentive environment because at best it's the way it is now. I think it will probably be a little bit less. So I think that we'll have super important incentives for antimicrobial resistance. We would be the first. That would be very cool. The first region in the world to do something on that. But in terms of making us super competitive, I don't think that's the one. And today, you said it at the beginning, you asked us for a vote. But every day that passes, things happen that make us less competitive. So I think this is one of the ingredients, but there are lots of other ingredients that have to be taken into decisions that have to be made to reverse the trend of losing competitiveness and change it. And the legislation is one, but there's also all the way upstream in the ecosystem, making sure that we give the right investment, that we make sure that our fantastic researchers have somewhere to go, that they have the right landscape in front of them, and then there's all the way up to the market access and having something that is predictable and attractive in terms of market access. If not, we are just going to continue that trend, and falling below 5 is not great.
One of the areas that was flagged by the Draghi report was AI. Dean, I wondered maybe, how would you compare our use currently in Europe of AI with the likes of the US, China, the Middle East? And is this an area you think we could feasibly compete, or are we already falling behind, and is that race already lost?
The race is absolutely not lost. We can definitely compete because you're going back to the fundamental research, and this continent has great fundamental research. AI is only as good as the information on which it's built. Okay? We have an opportunity. We have the ambitious European health data space. It's very ambitious. That is fantastic. Okay? It's a little bit like if you shoot for the stars, you'll get a long way. So I think we should embrace that, speed up the discussion, speed up the implementation, because what we need is high quality, curated, enriched, privacy protected information on which to build the algorithms to train the tools that are using it. There are fantastic companies coming out of all of our countries who are at the leading edge. We work with them, in imaging, in all kinds of areas. However, today, the appetite for where they will get their commercial return is not in Europe because it's hard to navigate. Our challenge, we talk about health competitiveness, and I think we say we should be very competitive because we're 450 million people. But when it comes down to buying things in healthcare, we're not. We're not even 27 member states. We're the regions within. And I think what we've got to use the opportunity of all of these legislations that are going to come through, the improvements of CTR, is take a look at how much progress we made by creating the EMA so many years ago, by putting some more decisions back into the centre, creating frameworks that everybody adheres to. We're not going to remove the final say by the member states, but there's just too much fragmentation today. That Brussels effect, that's well known of having a good legislation that percolates through. We saw it with GDPR, but unfortunately we all live with 27 plus interpretations of GDPR. We can't have 27 plus interpretations of implementation of pharma regulation, changes in CTR, whatever may come of the Biotech Act. We have to have more consistency. And then, if we're applying that to data and data interoperability, then we'll be able to drive the adoption of AI and be competitive, not just in health, but in other sectors as well. So it's not a lost race. We have the skills. We just have to act more coherently.
I mean, you mentioned the European health data space, which obviously was agreed last year, and which is, the system in which our health data will be collected, anonymized, and made available for research purposes, to put it in kind of crude terms. I did want to ask Gloria, I don't know if how the implementation is going on a national level, if you're able to say anything on that. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Well, it is going. That's what I can say. So it is ongoing. I think you're right, it's a challenge just to make the data infrastructure work. And even it's a challenge on the level of a government. You need to contract companies that can build the data sets and the infrastructure for you. And even this is a challenge. Sometimes a quote that sticks to me whenever I ask one of my agencies, for instance, like, why can't we do this better? And they say, like, yeah, it's because all of the good programmers are with Google. It takes an incredible long time to build up a data system, and then even it takes a longer time to build up a good one. But we are very ambitious, I would say. We are working on it, and that's it, yeah.
Okay. I was going to ask if, for those of us in Belgium, when do you think we'd actually be using this system? But it sounds like...
Well, Belgium is not doing so badly in terms of data infrastructure. I think we're actually leading, and there's more to come. For instance, thinking of real-world evidence, we are building an evidence platform right now that will accompany reimbursement decisions, because more and more medicines come to the market with significant uncertainties in terms of overall survival rates, for instance. And so we are setting up infrastructures between hospitals to collect the data from the patients, the real-world evidence on what the effect of this medicine in practice is. So I think there really is a lot to come. I think a lot of programmers are making an incredible amount of money of us. And
I would echo. We work with governments across the region and elsewhere, and I would certainly say that Belgium is
Yeah.
one of the leading countries in this space. So I know it was your own assessment, but I would echo that, having had discussions across other member states.
I also wanted to talk, do you want to come in on, I was going to ask you the next question, but if you have something specifically on EHS you want to say, you're very welcome.
EHS, or more generally speaking on data.
Yeah.
I think in the context, we just talked about artificial intelligence, digitalization in general terms. Data is gold. And we need to understand that in every aspect of what we're doing, data is what's going to be driving progress. And when we see that, of course, in the context of real-world evidence, but I could bring also the context of medicine shortages, where we need to have access to data to be able to better, prevent or address certain type of shortages. So the concept of data as a whole in Europe, and in the context of European health data space and the potential that access to data for secondary use of data brings, I think this is essential to acknowledge that. So it's nice to think of artificial intelligence, and at least from a regulator point of view, we look across when it comes to artificial intelligence, but the underlying foundation of this will be data.
And I mean, just on AI, I wonder to what extent actually is it being used at the moment by the EMA, and is there kind of obvious room for expansion in terms of how you're currently using it, or is there obvious areas where you see it's like being used in the future?
Yeah, so first of all, AI is sometimes when you speak about AI, your head spins because there's so many potential with AI. So it's a matter of making sure how you categorize artificial intelligence in specific needs. So there is either the support we provide to medicine developers that use AI, but your question, it focuses more on how we incorporate AI in our process, and that links to efficiency. So yeah, we're very interested in that. There is opportunities that we're exploring in supporting certain aspect of our process, like scientific advice, procedures, not in an independent way, but to support our experts in accessing some of the information and compiling some of the information that could be of value to them. We would want to expand that to the assessment of medicines, and very much so as well to the aspect of pharmacovigilance and safety monitoring of drugs when they are in the market. So definitely a great interest. We have a lot of activities within the agency and within the network of regulators in Europe to specifically tackle the opportunities that AI provides, yes.
Well, if I could just add a comment. We talked about AI in the context of data and algorithms, but we heard from Gloria earlier, one of the challenges is just the overall affordability of health because the cost in other departments. The use of the AI tools is where we have a real chance just to save money and reduce the burden on the day-to-day work that the healthcare professionals do. There's examples in hospitals in Belgium that are using AI-assisted tools for just taking the notes, AI scribes, documentation, or robotics moving things around the hospital. Cases where certain hospitals have saved 4 FTEs in one department, 4 people's worth of time in one department. And if you can scale that, and there's plenty of examples across many other countries and many other hospitals which have proven that if we just use the existing tools in the existing framework, we can save an awful lot of time of hard-pressed healthcare professionals. That will save money and allow that investment in other areas, whether it's your mental health services, whether it's into new innovative drugs, etc. So I think we don't just look in the context of AI, algorithms and data, but existing tools applied to reduce workflow tasks and that automation element. It's not what can happen tomorrow. It's happening today. We just have to embrace it at scale.
Okay. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking that is actually all we have time for. So thank you everyone for your time and your contributions and for such an interesting and engaging chat. To our audience, please do stay seated. We have what's next, I'm sure will be a great panel with my colleague Bartosz. She'll be moderating the panel discussion, The Food Equation, Security Meets Sustainability. Thanks everyone. Cheers.